In today's video, we're going to talk about MicroStrategy's recent Bitcoin buy. As you may know, in the last video, we talked about how MicroStrategy was rumored to have moved some coins. Michael Saylor said that was a rumor, that was false, and that he will continue buying. We're going to look at what he recently bought in terms of Bitcoin. We're also going to talk about the likelihood of a Fed cut. And Bitcoin just did something that is not good. First off, just glancing at the market, you can see that, again, most risk on is selling off. We do have a little bit of hype in AI right now. Today, at least, Google's up, Iron's up, some of the AI slash Bitcoin miners are up, but it's definitely a bit of a mixed day. A lot of risk on is selling off, and a lot of the boring, safe stocks are doing pretty well today. And where the Bitcoin miners are concerned, you know, we have a pretty mixed day. I would honestly have expected a lot more red because of what Bitcoin just did over the weekend. So it is nice to see a couple names in the green. Now, looking at the MicroStrategy news, first off, ignore this comment. Their average entry is not 100K. They thought they were a bad trader, but they're actually bad at reading comprehension. Now, MicroStrategy has acquired 8,178 Bitcoin at $835 million with an average price of $102,000. So yes, this purchase is now in the red if you just look at this one purchase. But their average is $74,000 per Bitcoin. One thing people say is, you know, if Bitcoin goes under the average, Michael Saylor will have to be liquidated and all this nonsense. You know, last cycle we saw Bitcoin get down to $15,000. Michael Saylor and MicroStrategy's average was much higher than that at the time. If MicroStrategy didn't go bankrupt last cycle where we saw about a 70% drop, I doubt highly that they're going to have any trouble this cycle. As we progress through Bitcoin cycles, the crypto winters become less severe. And I'll show you guys that shortly. But Strategy now holds 649,000 Bitcoin, getting close to that 650,000. It'll be exciting to see the day that they hold 1 million Bitcoin. And that day is coming. All right, now we've got some bad news for Bitcoin, and the market definitely reacted to it. We see that the 50 MA didn't hold up on that weekly candle, and it looks like we're selling off more. This is something that was very important to see hold because throughout this whole cycle, we have held it up as a support. You can see that from the beginning of the cycle, when we broke out of the 50 MA, we did never get back under it. We wicked down to it, but we were quickly recovered. You know, this was a good support. People jumped in with buys. This time it doesn't seem to be the case that much. We're getting that break under the 50 MA. We got a bad reaction on that as well. We need to reclaim it. If this comes as resistance, that would be a horrible sign. In the past cycles, once this becomes resistance, you get a more substantial drop. We need to reclaim that 50 MA on the weekly. You know, in the last two cycles, once it became resistance, it just accelerated the drop. In the first Bitcoin cycle, it just dropped it, didn't find it as resistance until much later, where basically 3 months later, after it found it as resistance, it recovered and rallied very quickly. Hopefully, we do find it as resistance, we rally within a few months after. Preferably, we don't find it as resistance and we just break right back over and rally to all-time highs. There's of course the possibility that the market makers fake things out. People see a break of the 50 MA on the weekly, think there's a lot more pain coming. Maybe we're near the bottom here. I would be very cautious if you're short-term on Bitcoin. And I think there may be more room for more pain. One thing we need to see after a couple days is a bounce on this death cross. Throughout this cycle, every death cross has marked a low point. There's a death cross here in September 2023. Another death cross here in August of 2024 with all that Mt. Gox fear. Brought us down to $50,000. Rallied to new all-time highs. Dropped again. Broke under the 50 and the 200 MA on the daily. Saw a death cross again. Marked a low. And we rallied. Here's our fourth death cross this cycle. Throughout this cycle, it has ended up being a great buying opportunity. Of course, on the daily here, we're near oversold. Last time Bitcoin was actually oversold was back in February of 2025. And in hindsight, that was a buying opportunity. Bitcoin was 93,000. And shortly after that time, we did see new all-time highs. Now, I wonder if this is really about the cycle coming to an end, or if this is more about the lack of future rate cuts because of how much the market has shifted in terms of expectations of rate cuts. Plus, you know that around us, we've seen risk on selling off because of this rate cut news, because of these expectations of rate cuts. So is it about the cycle ending early, or is Bitcoin reacting to these rate cuts? I think it's the latter. And looking at the Fed Watch tool, you'll see that we have a more likelihood than not of no rate cut. This previously, like a week or two ago, was a 90-something% chance of a rate cut. Now we're looking at a 40% chance. We're more likely to not see a cut, 60% probability of no cut. Upcoming economic data that we do get will be very important. And this will obviously shift the direction of a rate cut or lack thereof. I think any positive news for a rate cut, say if inflation actually comes down, say if the job market looks weaker, The Fed being more likely to cut will, in my opinion, bring a rally for risk on that has been selling off because of the lack of a rate cut in the future meeting. You know, one thing that's very interesting is despite Bitcoin's weakness, despite Bitcoin pulling back, breaking its 50 MA on the week, Bitcoin on exchanges is near all-time lows, despite this weakness in price. And here's the thing, cycle to cycle, the Bitcoin that's available will continue depleting over time. Plus, when you know that the vast majority of Bitcoin is already in circulation, already mined, it's hard not to be bullish. According to this site that I'll link down below for you guys, Bitcoin that's left to be mined is only 1,049,000 Bitcoin. Of the 21 million max supply of Bitcoin, only 1 million is left to mine throughout the rest of Bitcoin's future. See how this curves? We are hitting that kind of plateau where we're just slowly getting more Bitcoin in the supply. And this is going to be happening over decades and decades, getting that last roughly 1 million Bitcoin. One of the best things about Bitcoin, it's scarcity. The fact that every cycle, we're going to have less and less Bitcoin coming into the supply, coming into the, market. And that's why there's always this dynamic around the halvings. That's why Bitcoin always has this cyclical nature. It's so based around supply and demand. And I think it will always remain that way. There will always be some sort of cycle where we kind of rally around the halving in anticipation of the halving, usually beforehand. Get a rally, you get to buy the rumor, sell the news event, Bitcoin sells off, and then it continues rallying until we repeat the cycle. This drop here could be a beginning of repeating the cycle where we drop a little bit more. But times like these, you have to be bullish because when you look in hindsight, usually these are the best opportunities you could ever buy. We have seen worse throughout this cycle. For example, last correction, last pullback, we saw about a 32% drop before we saw that death cross and rallied to new all-time highs. Of course, the Mt. Gox drop, we dropped down roughly 32% as well. Maybe we need a couple more percent if we see a repeat, this 30% drop, 32% or so, then we get a rally. We're getting close to that point. Of course, we have Bitcoin near oversold on the daily. We've got still elevated levels of fear for Bitcoin. I think this is a good time to buy. Of course, there's possibly more pain ahead, but are we going to see the type of pullbacks in previous cycles? Like, for example, the last cycle, we saw about a 77% drop from the all-time highs, bringing us down to 15,000, 77% down. Cycle beforehand, the 2017 peak, we saw about an 84% drop. And Bitcoin's 2013 peak, we saw an 87% drop. As the cycles progress, the bear markets get less severe, as you can see. There's a good chance, at the worst this cycle, we see maybe a 50 to 60% correction. Where would that put Bitcoin? A 50% correction would put it right near its previous all-time high last cycle. Bitcoin does tend to test the area of its all-time high. You see that the 2017 peak here was eventually tested in the next bear market in the next cycle. So there's a possibility, if we do continue down, our max pain, you're talking about running to like 55,000 maybe at the worst, if even that. There's a possibility Bitcoin doesn't drop that much. So I guess long story short, as the cycles progress, the drops will be less severe. And in my opinion, you need to be quicker to bounce on these corrections because of that fact. But how are you guys feeling right now? Are you seeing Bitcoin as a golden buying opportunity, or do you think there's going to be more pain ahead because of the break of that 50 MA on the weekly? Do you think this death cross is going to bring us a pop like we have seen every time this cycle? Are you kind of just waiting to see how things play out before you make another move? Do you just DCA in Bitcoin and ignore all the noise? Thanks as always for watching, guys. I appreciate you, and I'll see you next time.